So welcome to lesson 2.3, which is about the shape of history. Now, there are two basic ideas about the shape of history. Firstly, that it is linear. History moves in a straight line. And secondly, that it is cyclical. History goes in a circle. And some people argue for a combination of the two. And with the linear conception of history, it's never repeating itself, it's always moving on to new things. So there's an overall sense of evolution, of development, of progress, of cumulative change. And because it's moving from A to B, so it's moving from here to there, there's a sense that it's moving towards some kind of goal, some destination, so that history has a purpose. So with these theories of history, there can be a sense that history is purposeful. Whereas with the cyclical approach, it's not moving towards some particular point, but it's always going back on itself. So there's an eternal return, and any progress that occurs is eventually undone as it goes back again. So there is no overall progress. And so in this sense, history can seem to be meaningless. It goes round and round. It's not going anywhere in particular. And linear theories of history tend to be popular in ascendant societies, societies that are going places, that are making progress, that are on the rise. And that's perhaps because if you look back over your history and you see that you've come a long way, and if you're still making progress, then it would seem natural to think that progress will just keep continuing on into the future. Whereas cyclical theories tend to be popular in declining societies. And that's perhaps because it's comforting. If you see yourself declining, you can think, well, it's not really our fault, it's just the general behaviour of history. And things will eventually come round again and we'll start moving up eventually. And Oswald Spengler said that systems that show linear change are the province of history in the technical or traditional sense of the word, and systems that show cyclical change are the province of science. Now, what did he mean by that? Well, if change is linear, so it's not repeating itself, but it's always moving on to new things, then there's no way to summarize it. The only way we can describe what's happening is to tell its story, to tell how one thing has led to another. And so that is a traditional kind of history that we get in history books. Whereas when there is a cyclical pattern to change, then we can summarize it. We can say that it follows a particular path. And he gave the example of planets orbiting the sun. So Newtonian gravity creates the orbits of planets, and each orbit is very much like the last one. So we don't need to tell the history of the orbits, we just describe the properties of the orbit. So we can describe that pattern, and so we're in the realm of science, of rules of behaviour. And so it's perhaps not a coincidence that as history now, the study of history is taking on this scientific approach, or some people are adopting this scientific approach to history, that a lot of the theories that are coming out tend to be cyclical, involving cycles in history. but not all. And Kenneth Boulding, who was an economist and philosopher, he said that linear makes it difficult to have theory because it involves the growth of knowledge, and we can't know what knowledge people will have in future, because if we knew what they would know, we would know it already. So we can't really describe how things are going to develop. But what he's saying is not entirely true, that we can't be scientific about it, because we do have sciences like geology and evolutionary biology where there is overall change and evolution and development, but we can be scientific because we can perhaps identify trends, or we can identify constraints on the way things develop. So science is not about being able to predict the future like fortune telling, but is about understanding the rules of the system. And we can perhaps do that with history, so that even though it is linear, we can perhaps have theories that identify trends and constraints. So, for example, it might be something like the evolution of human transportation capabilities. We might find that, for example, the top speed of the current transport technology is increasing at an exponential rate. For example, there's a pattern in the trend of our transport capabilities. And also people have suggested that people spend a fixed amount of their daily time on travel, so that in the Middle Ages the peasants walked an hour to and from their fields, and today people commute an hour to and from their work in the city. Today people travel much further during their day, but the amount of time they spend on travel is the same as a medieval peasant. That is one argument. And so if we understand that constraint, then we can say what future technologies, future transportation technologies, even though we don't know what they are at the moment, but if we can say that whatever increase in the speed of human movement they deliver, it will lead to a certain amount of growth in the connectivity of society, because we know that people will continue to spend that 1 hour on travel, so we know how much further they will be able to travel in their daily routine. So let's talk a little bit more about linear theories. Now, I suggested that linear theories involve an idea of overall progress, but in fact the Greek poet Hesiod, who was a poet in the dark ages of Greece before the rise of classical Greece, so we don't really know very much about him, but he suggested a picture of history that it is a descent from an original golden age through a silver age to a bronze age to what he called the age of heroes, and then to the Iron Age of his own time, which he saw as kind of the lowest, the decadent society. And so for Hesiod, history was linear, but linear and down. And then Plato said, well, yes, but in fact, if you have good rulers, they can actually take you back into a golden age. So good rulers, a good ruler can take you back to the golden age, and then this descent can start again. So I suppose Plato kind of turned it into a bit of a cycle. And then Plato's pupil Aristotle said, well, if you look at nature, there is often progress and growth. So he took the example of a plant which starts off as a seed, then turns into a seedling, then develops into a mature plant, and then eventually flowers and achieves its final stage of blossoming. And he suggested this kind of linear growth may be characteristic of societies as well. And then in the time of the European Enlightenment, which was of course a time of great progress in Europe, and so as we've just said, we would expect that to be a time of favouring linear theories. There was this view that indeed society had moved from the state of savagery up to the present state of civilization. And people discussed what are the things that drive this motion. Why have we evolved in this way? And they suggested some of the drivers might be people's capacity for intellectual inquiry. So humans like to find out about the world and find out how it works. And so as we develop a better understanding of how the world works, we're able to control our environment more effectively, and so we move to the civilized state. Or another suggestion is that it's driven by socio-economic factors. So it's about making life more comfortable and to find better ways of doing things, and also to trade with each other, which then spreads knowledge. So all these things are what are driving this evolution. And then another simple idea is that it's just a question of the cropping up of individual geniuses who come up with new ideas which then become part of the common stock of humanity. And so it's a kind of ratcheting up. Now, I said that these linear theories can involve the idea that history has some kind of goal. We're moving towards something. We're moving towards an end point. So they can be said to be teleological. Teleos is the Greek for an end point. So teleological, we mean that these theories suggest that history is kind of being pulled by, or pulled towards a particular endpoint. It's that endpoint, our destination, that shapes everything that happens before. It's all leading towards that. So if you want to understand history, you understand our destination. That will tell you how we are developing towards it. And what are some of the purposes that people have identified in history? Well, one is that it's just general improvement in our way of life. This is known as the Whig interpretation of history. The Whig was a nickname for the British Progressive Party in the 18th and 19th century. So as a progressive party, they emphasised society or the progress of society as the goal of where society should be heading. And so yes, it was all about improving, making life more comfortable, making life safer, making life healthier, and so on. That's the purpose of history in the Whig interpretation of history. We could also have, say, the Christian interpretation of history, that it's all about moving towards God's kingdom on earth, bringing God's plan into existence. And the Catholic philosopher Teilhard de Chardin, he was a Jesuit priest in the mid-20th century, talked about history as being about the movement from alpha to omega. So alpha is the beginning, the creation, and omega is when humanity achieves unity with God and perfect consciousness, maybe leaving behind our material bodies and achieving final enlightenment. That was Teilhard de Chardin's view. Another one we discussed briefly in lesson 1.3 when discussing the history of theoretical history, Hegel's idea that it's all about freedom. It's all about people developing an understanding that freedom is a proper goal and then moving towards that goal. And he suggested that societies move through various stages of increasing freedom. And this is what led to Francis Fukuyama writing his book, The End of History. He said, well, if we take Hegel seriously, that history is all about the realization of human freedom, and we look at the West today, well, it's already free, it's already achieved that. And all the other societies around the world are moving in the same direction as the West. They're trying to move towards the same level of development and human freedom. So if that's what, according to Hegel, history is all about, well, we're coming towards the end of history. We're reaching that goal of freedom. Well, of course, Fukuyama didn't necessarily really believe that history was coming to an end, but he was just saying that this is kind of the logic. If we took what Hegel is saying, we are achieving what Hegel thought of as the end of history. But of course, what people have pointed out since is that actually it's not clear that freedom is increasing, and in fact, we'll be seeing later on in the course that those people who study freedom seem to find it is decreasing around the world at the moment. So that may be, according to Hegel, the purpose of history, but maybe we're not really there yet, as Fukuyama was suggesting we might be. And the last thing I'll mention is this idea of a singularity, which we've discussed in the last two lessons, that if, say, we look at something like the big history milestones measuring human progress, it's not a steady upward increase, but it's very slow, and then it's suddenly taking off, and it's following this curve known as a hyperbola, leading to this singularity when it reaches infinity here. So it can't go beyond that because it's shooting off to infinity. Now, things can't really achieve infinity, clearly, so the question is, what actually does this mean? What happens when we get to this singularity? And as I mentioned in the previous lesson, in fact, if we look at the development of stone tools, we can draw an exactly similar curve. The efficiency of stone tools was also increasing in a hyperbolic fashion. And if we look specifically at stone tools, they would have reached a singularity, sometime thousands of years BC. But what actually happened? Well, stone tools didn't become infinitely efficient. But what happened was we moved into the metal age. People discovered bronze working. Let's just say bronze. So we could think of bronze as kind of an infinitely efficient stone tool. It's a transformation to a whole new regime. And maybe that's what's happening with the singularity that people see coming up in the next few years or few decades, that it will be a transformation to a new regime, which we don't necessarily know what that will look like yet. So yes, these are 4 ways people have thought about the purpose of history, that it's all about improvement, that it's all about achieving God's kingdom on earth, that it's about moving towards greater freedom, or that we're moving towards some kind of singularity that will then lead to a transformation and a whole new round of development. And lastly, then, the linear theories involve this idea of evolution, and many people who've developed the linear theories have described this evolution in terms of a set of evolutionary stages. So I'll talk through some of those theories and how they identify evolutionary stages. So again, back in lesson 1.3, I mentioned Lewis Henry Morgan in the 19th century and his idea of society moving through these stages of savage to barbarian to civilized. And somebody who was writing a little bit earlier than Morgan is Johann Bachhofen, who saw the evolution of society in terms of sexual relations, so or gender relations anyway. So he suggested that in the earliest phase of human society, it was what he called a heterist society. Hetera is a Greek word meaning courtesan, so heterist, it means sexually liberated. So in this time, women were very dominant and they were sexually liberated women. That was his view anyway. So we're talking about the cave dwelling times. And then he suggested with the invention of agriculture, society moved on to matriarchy. So again, women were still dominant and the family was focused around the mother. And men were kind of hangers-on. And then he suggested society moved into what he called the Dionysian phase. Dionysus is a Greek god of wine and was worshipped through dancing rituals and orgies, basically. So he saw this as a time still of very free sexual relations, and people emphasized carefree enjoyment of life. And then finally he suggested society moved on to the Apollonian stage, which is the emergence of patriarchy. So society then became very serious and very rational and law-like. So rather than carefree happiness, it was much more ordered and regulated and controlled.
The point is that in the Dionysian era, men and women were equal, whereas in the Apollonian, men became dominant.
Some people have thought about the evolutionary stages in terms of the evolution of intellectual ideas, or the evolution of people's understanding of the world. And the key person there is Auguste Comte. So he identified 3 stages: the theological, the metaphysical, and then the scientific. So what he was suggesting was that back in the cave dwelling times, people had magical ideas about the world, fictional ideas. They believed in spirits in the trees and in the streams, and they saw supernatural in everything. Then moving on, say, to the Middle Ages, people still thought about the world using really their own intuition. They didn't necessarily believe in spirits in the trees, but they still believed in a supernatural world, and their understanding of the world was very abstract. It was based on, their mental ideas about the world, and a whole elaborate mental system that came from the human imagination. But then we moved on to the materialist scientific world, where now our ideas about the world are based on experiments. So we see how the world actually works, and then that is what feeds our understanding of the world. So for Comte, the linear change was the movement through these stages. And another person who had something very similar I mentioned is the British anthropologist James Fraser, who wrote the book The Golden Bough, which is a massive study of myth in many volumes, I think something like 12 volumes. And he had very much the same scheme. He just had different names for it. He called this the magical stage, the religious, and like Comte, the last stage is the scientific. And then other people have thought about social evolution in terms of economic matters, how people make their living. So back in the days of the European Enlightenment, there's Anne Turgot, who I've mentioned back in lesson 1.3. He identified the stages of human society as firstly foraging, so that's the cave dwelling times when people lived off the land, to pastoralism, so people were still nomadic like the foragers, but they took with them their herds of sheep and goats, their animals. And then people settled down and farmed the fields, and so society moved into the stage of proper agriculture. And then lastly, he argued the emergence of commerce and industry. People now made their living not just through farming, but through all sorts of crafts and trades, and that's the stage of capitalism. Which is not to say that people necessarily, believe these today, but this is how Turgot suggested these were the evolutionary stages that he saw. But someone who's sort of adopted something similar much more recently is an Australian biologist, Stephen Boyden, who talks about what he calls the primeval societies, then the stage of early farming, then early urbanism, first cities, and then today's high energy societies. So, people first just lived off the land, then they started cultivating the land, then they lived in much higher densities, and then finally today we have lifestyles that depend not just on what we ourselves can do, but on fossil fuels and nuclear power, and a great amplification of the energy available to society. And also in this sort of group of people who talk about the social evolution in terms of economic matters is, of course, Karl Marx. And this is one interpretation of his view, anyway, of social evolution. So it started with primitive communism, the foraging, the primeval times, according to these other people. Primitive communism, people shared and were egalitarian, and society was simple, and there was no leaders, there was no status differences. And then that led on to, according to Marx, thinking about the Roman Empire and people like Alexander the Great, the age of imperialism. And then that in turn gave way to feudalism, which gave way to, again, capitalism. And Marx saw this as continuing on to when the workers would start to take back power from the capitalists, the bosses, and own their own labour and own the factories in which they worked, and things would be fairer. And then finally this utopia of a return to communism, but this will be advanced communism. But again, people will be completely equal, men and women will be equal, and the machines will be doing much of the work, so people will be very carefree and won't be the drudges working in the factories as they were in the Industrial Revolution and still are today. And then another person working sort of similarly on the idea of economic change was W. Rostoff. This is in the 1950s, and he looked at how the Western nations had developed, and he identified a series of 5 stages in their growth of prosperity. So he said they started in the traditional societies, so the stage of traditionalism. Then came the development of the preconditions for takeoff. Preconditions like banking systems, better ships and navigation that would lay the way for great commerce. And then came the takeoff, which was when there was a turning point from society having hardly changed. People's incomes had hardly changed for centuries. But then the takeoff, they shifted to a regime where life was getting better all the time. And then that led on from the takeoff to the drive to maturity, which was when society kept on improving, having got through this turning point. And then the last stage was the stage of mass consumption. You can read that, that's supposed to say mass consumption. So in this stage, people were still generally quite poor, but at this stage they became consumers and they started to see real gains in their standards of living. And so the point of Rostoff doing this was to give advice to the developing world at that time, to say, well, look, this is how the West did it, so these are the stages you need to go through. And so if you're trying to prepare your society to become developed, there's no point in doing things that are characteristic of the drive to maturity phase if you haven't yet established the preconditions for the takeoff. So that was the point of his scheme. And then one last person I'll mention with an evolutionary scheme is Nikolai Kardashev, a Russian astronomer who was not so much concerned with the evolution of society on Earth as the evolution of societies in the galaxy and in the universe. So he suggested that we could divide societies into those that control the resources of an entire planet, which he called Type 1 societies. So humans haven't yet reached Type 1. We don't really control the resources of the whole Earth. We control a large portion of them, the oil and the minerals on the Earth and the energy coming in from the sun. And so we're moving towards Type 1. And then there's the next stage is societies that control the resources of an entire solar system. So not just one planet, but all the planets of the solar system and its star. And then the next stage is Type 3 societies, which control the resources of an entire galaxy. So this is a simple simplification of his theory. You can add other stages and so on. But that's the basic idea, that it's what proportion of the universe your society controls. And I'll finish with some criticisms of these ideas. So the first point, well, it's not really a criticism perhaps, but it's that we shouldn't think of the earlier stages in these schemes as being somehow backward, because it's the efforts of the people in the earlier stages that leads on to the later stages. So today we may enjoy a very rich and comfortable lifestyle, but that's not because of anything we did. It's not because of our efforts. It's because of the efforts of the people who went before us in these earlier stages. They improved life, and we are now the beneficiaries of it. So that is one thing. The people in these early stages are not backward or inferior in any way. It's their genius that led on to the later stages. Then another point, which is perhaps more of a criticism, is that these schemes suggest that society has to go up a ladder, and it has to go up in a particular order. But that's not necessarily the case, and this is particularly a criticism of Rostov's theory, that the developing countries don't necessarily need to follow the same path as today's rich and developed countries. So an example might be Brazil. People suggested, well, Brazil, to develop economically, needs to build railways, because the railway was very important in the development of the United States, linking all the places across the whole continent together and creating a single market. But the trouble is that in the Amazon jungle, as soon as you lay railway tracks, the jungle is trying to cover them up again. And so the railway isn't really appropriate for the conditions in Brazil. But what Brazil does have is a very extensive air network. So that is much more suited to the problems of creating a transportation network around Brazil. So Brazil didn't have to follow the same path as the United States. It could use the aircraft, which didn't exist in the 19th century when the United States was developing, but it does exist today. So it can kind of leapfrog and doesn't need to follow things in the same order. So these evolutionary ideas are maybe too rigid. And then a last criticism is of evolutionary schemes is that they often just suggest these stages, but they don't give any particular reason as to why society should move from one stage to the next. It's just kind of assumed that society will somehow follow one after the other. Now, somebody who can't be criticised in that way is, of course, Karl Marx, because, as we suggested when we talked about his ideas in lesson 1.3, he did suggest a very clear mechanism as to that drives society through these stages, which is that in each stage there are winners and losers, and then there's a conflict between the winners and the losers, and the resolution of that conflict leads to new institutions that are acceptable to both, and that creates the new form of society. But then that new form of society in itself also generates a new sets of winners and losers, and so the process continues. And now let's move on to cyclical theories. Just say a few things about them. So we can have various kinds of cycles in society. We can have pulsations, things that expand and contract, like in the economy, expand and contract, boom and bust. We can have one-off rise and fall. So things like empires that rise and fall, or commercial companies that, have great success, but then maybe their product becomes obsolete and so they decline and disappear again. So this is a cycle because we keep seeing it happening over and over again, but it happens to different empires and to different companies. But it's in each case, it's a one-off rise and fall. And then we can have genuine oscillations. So something like the anacyclosis of Polybius that we saw. There's a C missing there, sorry. Anacyclosis of Polybius. So this evolution, also this cycle in political institutions from democratic to despotism and back again. And we can also think about cycles in terms of how many phases they have. So some cycles just are two-stroke cycles, such as an oscillation between war and peace. So there are two poles and society just keeps oscillating back and forth between them. But another way of thinking about cycles is that they have four phases, four-stroke cycle. And a good metaphor for these is in terms of the seasons of the year. So here there's a spring, a summer, an autumn, and a winter. And we go through those four phases. And the point about spring is that it's cold but getting warmer. Summer is warm and getting warmer. Autumn is warm and getting cooler. And winter is cold and getting colder. So it's where you are and which direction you're travelling in defines these four different phases. And another way of thinking about cycles is Hegel's concept of the thesis, the antithesis or antithesis, leading to the synthesis. So Hegel's idea is that you have a certain situation in society, that's the thesis, and it produces a reaction. And this is the antithesis, the antithesis. And then the conflict between the two leads you to a resolution, which is the synthesis. And then this synthesis becomes the thesis for the next cycle, a repetition of this. So it develops another antithesis and then a new synthesis. And this is, of course, the basic idea behind Marx's idea of conflict in society leading to new institutions and propelling society through its evolutionary stages. And we can have cycles with other variations of, that's for the full stroke, other numbers of phases or just a continuous cycle. These are just some examples. And the durations of cycles can, vary. Some people identify cycles in the economy lasting just a few months. Then we can have cycles of rise and fall lasting thousands of years, and so any kind of duration between. And another point to talk about is that each cycle can be different. Each cycle has a different character. So this is not necessarily the case for all cycles, but it's just that when we're talking about cycles, it may be that successive cycles have some broadly similar properties, but also they differ in some way. And I'll give an example of that with feudalism. Now let's just pause a moment to clarify what we mean by feudalism. So in Roman times, the state interacted directly with the citizens. It taxed them and it extracted services from them directly. And today it's the same. the government extracts money from us through our taxes directly, and it rules over us directly. It sets laws that affect our lives directly. But in the Middle Ages, that was not the case. We had the institutions of feudalism, which created a kind of hierarchical structure to society. So the king didn't interact directly with the people at the bottom. The king interacted with his lords, and he extracted money and services from the lords. And then the lords had their knights, and the lords extracted money and services from the knights. But they didn't worry about where the knights got it from, but the knights then extracted money and services from the people below them, the squires, or ultimately the peasants. So this is feudalism. And the point is that feudalism rose and fell. So it went through a whole cycle. And it emerged out of a crisis, which was the end of the Roman Empire. And it firstly developed, this kind of spring, summer, autumn, winter process. So it developed, it then had a great flourishing when it was at its height in the, what we call in English history anyway, the High Middle Ages. And then it began to decay. The feudal rules were being subverted in various ways, and then finally it fell and disappeared. And one suggestion is that it was particularly given the coup de grace by the Black Death, which led to a great reduction in population and made feudalism untenable. Now that's not necessarily true. There were other, there were criticisms of that view, but that is an idea that has been discussed much in the past. But we're not really interested in whether this is accurate or not. I'm just illustrating the point that this is a cycle of social evolution based around feudalism, starting with a crisis and ending with the crisis. And then this crisis, if we follow, say, Marx, leads on to another form of social institution that may itself be going through a cycle. So it also developed, so that's what Rostov would be talking about, the preconditions for takeoff, developing those things like banking systems. Then it flourished in the Industrial Revolution. It was at its height. And then maybe today, it's decaying, it's losing its legitimacy perhaps. And then certainly that's what Marx would be arguing in his theory, and he would think that capitalism is eventually going to fall and then lead on to the next stage, which for him is socialism. So it's another cycle, which this crisis of the Black Death was the end of that cycle, the beginning of this one, and then there'll be some new crisis here which will lead on to socialism, if you're Marx. So both two cycles, but have very different characters. This cycle was based around feudalism, this cycle is based around capitalism. And another way we can see that is also in cycles in the economy. So when a new technology comes in, it tends to lead to a bit of a boom. So for example, in the 1990s, very few people had mobile phones. But the technology was catching on, and there was a proliferation of mobile phone shops in shopping centres, and more and more people were starting to get phones, and eventually everybody had them, even your granny had one. And not only that, but the technology itself was changing so fast that there was a big incentive for people to keep upgrading their phones, because now they could do text messaging, and now they could have a camera involved, and then they became smartphones and you had apps. And so people were there was a virgin market for all these new technologies. Lots and lots of people wanted them. But now we've got to the stage where phones aren't really changing very much from year to year, and everybody's got one. So it's only a case of ticking over. The occasional person who drops their phone, or it's got a bit old and they want to buy a new one. But so there was a kind of boom and then plateauing of the technology of the mobile phone. And then we could see that earlier with, say, the car. Again, the car started off as a luxury item, but then it became more of a mass market product, and then more and more people started getting cars, and then you saturated the market. Everybody had a car, and it was then just back to a turnover of new drivers coming in at the bottom, and existing drivers changing their car from time to time. So in each case, an economic cycle based around a new technology, with common features in both, but also a different character to each one, because the car's impact on society was different from the mobile phone's impact on society. And I said that some people suggest ways of looking at history that involve a combination of linear and cyclical. So let's finish looking at that. So combined linear cyclical ideas of history. Well, one way we can have a linear cyclical approach is if we've got a linear trend, and then we've got ups and downs superimposed on the trend. So, if we take away the trend, which we don't actually see, it looks like that. So there's an overall linear upward movement, but there are also these fluctuations superimposed on it. And this might be something like, if this is in the economy, it's the total wealth of society or something like that. And then some people have suggested a way of thinking about societies in terms of a spiral. So, we start here in the earliest societies, and we're going round in cycles, but at each cycle we're somehow getting more capable, and we're moving outwards from this original very simple society to more complex ones. So yes, it's a combination of a cyclical movement around that centre, and also a linear outward movement away from it. Or we could think of it the other way round. If we think of a society converging on some end point, if it's Hegel's idea of freedom as the end point of history. So we're just going round and round inwards this time to this goal of history. And then lastly, we can move into 3 dimensions and think that we're moving up along a particular path, but at the same time we're orbiting that path, we're cycling around it. So we end up with a helix. So it looks something like this, going up and round in these cycles at the same time.